concert hall was glowing that evening. The soft golden lights reflected off the walls, the velvet seats, and the shiny black piano placed at the center of the stage. People were dressed in their best clothes, men in suits and women in elegant dresses. They whispered quietly to each other, waiting for the famous pianist to appear. It was one of those nights where everything felt special, like something magical could happen. Then the lights dimmed a little. The room became silent. The sound of shoes echoed across the wooden floor as the pianist walked onto the stage. He was tall with silver hair and a calm, proud face. His tuxedo was perfect and his steps were full of confidence. Everyone clapped politely, showing their respect. The man smiled slightly, gave a short bow, and sat down in front of the grand piano. He took a deep breath, lifted his hands, and began to play. The first few notes floated gently through the air like ripples across water. The melody was smooth and controlled. Each movement of his fingers was precise, practiced, and professional. The audience sat quietly, watching him with admiration. This was what they had come for, to see a master at work. The music was beautiful, but in a way that felt almost too perfect, too clean. Every sound was in its right place, but there was something missing. Something invisible that only the heart could feel. In the middle of the audience, sitting next to his mother, was a small boy no older than 10. His name wasn't on the guest list. He wasn't wearing fancy clothes. His shirt was plain and his shoes were slightly worn out. But his eyes were full of light. He didn't blink much, afraid to miss even a single movement of the pianist's hands. The way the man played fascinated him. It wasn't just music to him. It was like magic. He had seen a piano only a few times before, mostly in pictures or on television. But something inside him always stirred when he heard its sound. Tonight, seeing it in real life, hearing it so close, it made his heart beat faster. He could feel every note inside his chest. Each sound told a story he somehow already knew. The boy's mother noticed his expression and smiled softly. "You like it, don't you?" she whispered. The boy nodded without taking his eyes off the stage. "Yes, I want to play like that one day." On stage, the pianist's fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys. The melody grew louder, stronger, grander. His hands blurred and the audience sat frozen in awe. When he finally hit the last note, the sound echoed through the hall before fading into silence. Then came the applause, loud, long, and full of admiration. The pianist stood, bowed again, and smiled proudly. But as the crowd clapped, the little boy didn't move. He wasn't clapping. He was thinking. There was a strange feeling in his heart, something between curiosity and courage. He couldn't explain it, but he wanted to touch that piano just once. It was like a voice inside him kept whispering, "You can do it. Just try." When the applause died down, the pianist began talking to the audience about his next piece. The boy's heart was racing. He looked at his mother, then at the piano again. Finally, he whispered, "Mama, can I go?" She looked surprised. "Go where?" "To the stage," he said quietly. "I just want to try." His mother shook her head quickly. No, you can't do that. This is not the place, sweetheart. That man is performing. People are watching. You'll disturb them." But the boy didn't seem afraid. His small hands were shaking a little, but his eyes were firm. "I can play too," he said softly, almost like he was talking to himself. Up on stage, the pianist was preparing to start his next song when he noticed some movement in the crowd. A small figure was walking down the aisle slowly but surely, through the rows of seats. People turned their heads, confused. Some smiled. Others frowned. The boy kept walking until he reached the edge of the stage. He looked up. The piano towered above him like a mountain. The pianist blinked, unsure what to do. The boy raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, can I try?" The hall fell into complete silence. You could hear the air itself. The audience stared, surprised by the tiny, brave voice. The pianist looked down at the boy, his eyebrows raised. He wasn't angry, just puzzled. "You want to try?" He repeated, his tone calm but amused. The boy nodded earnestly. "Yes, please." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then, with a faint, curious smile, he stepped back from the piano and gestured toward it. "Go ahead, then," he said gently, thinking it was just a harmless moment that would make the audience smile. The crowd chuckled softly. Some people whispered, "How cute." Others took out their phones, ready to record this little moment of innocence. No one expected anything more than a few random notes. But the boy took a deep breath, climbed onto the bench, and placed his fingers on the keys. His hands were small, barely reaching an octave. He sat still for a second, feeling the smooth surface of the piano. His heart was pounding. Then with closed eyes, he pressed the first note. It was clear, pure, real. The audience stopped whispering. The boy began to play, not like someone repeating notes they memorized, but like someone who had known music his whole life. The sound that came out was soft but powerful, full of feeling. Every note seemed to tell a story. The pianist, who had been smiling politely, now stood frozen beside him, his expression slowly changing from amusement to awe. The grand hall that had been filled with perfection moments ago was now filled with emotion. And for the first time that night, everyone truly listened. The sound of applause still echoed across the grand concert hall. People were standing, clapping for the pianist who had just finished his flawless performance. The man bowed gracefully, a small, proud smile on his face. But as the cheers began to fade and the audience started to settle, a small voice broke the rhythm of the evening. "Excuse me, sir. Can I try?" The words were soft yet clear enough to reach the stage. The pianist blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The audience turned their heads in confusion, searching for the source. Slowly, from one of the middle rows, a young boy stepped out. He was small, maybe 10 years old, wearing a simple white shirt and a gray vest that looked a little too big for him. His shoes were scuffed, his hair neatly combed, and his eyes wide with both fear and determination. The boy walked down the aisle, one small step at a time. The murmur in the hall grew louder. People whispered things like, "Whose child is that?" Or, "What's he doing?" Some laughed quietly, thinking it was adorable. Others frowned, annoyed that someone would interrupt such a prestigious concert. The pianist stood still, one hand resting on the grand piano. His expression was a mix of curiosity and disbelief. It wasn't every day that a child asked to try on one of the most famous stages in the world. He leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "What did you say, young man?" The boy looked up at him and repeated, a little louder this time. "Can I try?" "Please." A small wave of laughter rolled through the audience. The pianist's lips twitched in amusement. He had been performing for decades and had seen many strange things in his career. But this was new. He could see the boy's mother standing near the back of the hall, her face pale with embarrassment, her hands nervously clutching her purse. "Sweetheart, come back," she whispered urgently. But the boy didn't move. His eyes were locked on the piano like nothing else in the world mattered. For a moment, the pianist considered refusing. This was a professional concert, not a school talent show. But then something in the boy's eyes stopped him. There was no arrogance, no mischief, only sincerity. A quiet belief that he could do it. The man's curiosity got the better of him. He straightened his posture, glanced at the audience, and said with a light smile, "Why not?" The crowd chuckled again, this time with interest. Everyone leaned forward as the pianist stepped aside, gesturing toward the piano. "Go ahead," he said kindly, though he didn't expect much. The boy climbed the few steps to the stage, his small shoes tapping softly against the wood. The massive piano gleamed under the lights, and he hesitated for a moment, looking almost too small next to it. He turned to the pianist and whispered, "Thank you, sir." The man nodded, still smiling politely. He thought the boy would press a few random keys, make the audience laugh, and that would be the end of it. But what happened next would silence every soul in that room. The boy sat down on the piano bench. His feet dangled above the ground. For a moment, he didn't touch the keys. The entire hall was silent now, waiting. He took a deep breath, his little fingers hovering over the black and white keys. Then he closed his eyes and began to play. The first note rang out soft and pure, then another, then another. Slowly, a melody began to form, something haunting and beautiful. It wasn't any classical piece the audience recognized. It was simple, almost fragile, but it had life. It had feeling. The laughter stopped. The whispering stopped. Even the air seemed to still. The pianist's smile faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. He moved closer, watching the boy's hands. They were small but sure, moving with a kind of natural rhythm that didn't belong to a beginner. The child wasn't just pressing keys, he was speaking through them. Every note told a story. There was sadness, hope, and wonder mixed together. The melody rose and fell like waves, echoing softly through the great hall. The audience, who moments ago were restless, now sat completely still. Some people even forgot to breathe. Now sat completely still. Some people even forgot to breathe. The boy swayed slightly with the music, lost in it. His expression was peaceful, like he was home. It was as if the piano itself had been waiting for him all along. The pianist's heart began to pound. He had spent his entire life mastering technique. Every scale, every piece, every performance rehearsed to perfection. Yet this child, with no training, no reputation, was playing something more honest than anything he had ever heard. When the final note drifted into silence, the hall remained still. For a few long seconds, no one moved. Then someone began to clap. Slowly at first, then louder, until the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause. People stood on their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting. The boy blinked, startled, his hand still resting on the keys. The pianist placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, almost in awe, "Where did you learn that?" The boy looked up shyly and said, "I don't know. I just felt it." The man stared at him, speechless. For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. He didn't even have words. All he knew was that this little boy had just reminded him what real music was. Something you don't play with your fingers, but with your heart. The audience continued to cheer as the boy's mother rushed to the stage, tears in her eyes. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "I told you not to go, but you did it anyway." The pianist smiled softly, clapping along with the crowd. "No," he said under his breath, "he didn't just do it. He showed us." That night, no one remembered the pianist's flawless performance, but everyone remembered the moment when a little boy asked, "Can I try?" and left the world silent. The hall was still trembling with emotion. The crowd had just witnessed something unbelievable. A small boy sitting at the piano, playing as if he had been born for it. But for that one moment, time seemed to stop. Nobody could move. Nobody wanted to break the magic that filled the air. The boy sat on the bench, his small fingers resting on the last key he had touched. The sound of that final note faded slowly, echoing off the golden walls of the concert hall. The lights above shimmered softly on his face, revealing the sweat on his forehead and the calm focus in his eyes. He had not just played notes, he had told a story without words. Then came a soft gasp from someone in the audience. The people sitting in the front rows leaned forward. They could see the look on the pianist's face, surprise mixed with disbelief. The famous man who had performed before kings and queens now stood frozen beside the piano. His hand, once steady and full of control, hung uselessly by his side. He looked at the boy like he was seeing something impossible. The little boy had not played with perfect technique. His fingers were uneven at times, and his posture was not what a teacher would approve of. But every sound that came out of the piano was full of feeling. It wasn't practiced. It was real. The melody he played was soft at first, like a whisper from the heart, then rose into something strong and full of emotion. It was as if the piano itself was breathing through him. The audience could feel it too. The music wasn't familiar. It wasn't from any book or famous composer. But it reached people in a way no known piece could. Some listeners felt warmth rise in their chests. Others felt tears form in their eyes without even knowing why. The melody carried something deep, a sadness mixed with hope, pain mixed with beauty. It was pure human emotion, translated into sound. The boy's feet barely touched the pedals, but somehow he made the piano sing like it had a voice of its own. His eyes were closed the entire time, as if he wasn't in the grand hall anymore but somewhere far away. Maybe a small living room, maybe his dreams. Each note seemed to come from a place of memory, from a story that only he knew. The professional pianist, the man who had spent his life studying sheet music and performing to perfection, suddenly realized that all his years of training could not create this kind of feeling. What this boy had was not skill. It was soul. He glanced at the audience. Every face was turned toward the boy, not toward him. For the first time, he wasn't the center of attention, and strangely, he didn't feel jealous. He felt something else. Admiration. The melody changed again, this time softer, almost like a lullaby. It drifted gently across the hall, wrapping the audience in peace. Some people closed their eyes, letting the sound carry them away. It was as if they were all children again, listening to a story told through music. One woman in the front row pressed a hand to her heart, whispering, "It's beautiful." Another man wiped his eyes. Even the stage manager backstage, who had seen hundreds of concerts, stood still, unable to look away. The pianist slowly moved closer, watching the boy's hands. He noticed the way the child's little fingers curved naturally, finding the right keys without hesitation. It wasn't luck, it was instinct. The boy didn't know how to read notes, but he felt the music. His fingers followed what his heart wanted to say. Finally, the melody reached its end. The last note hung in the air like a breath that didn't want to end. Then silence. No one clapped at first. It wasn't because they didn't like it. It was because they were too moved to react. The air felt heavy with emotion, as if everyone needed a moment to return to reality. The boy opened his eyes and looked around. He seemed a little confused by the silence, like he was wondering if he had done something wrong. His small hands trembled slightly as he looked up at the pianist. The man stepped closer, his expression soft now. "What's your name, son?" he asked quietly. The boy blinked, surprised that the man was talking to him. "Eli," he said shyly. "Eli," the pianist repeated, smiling faintly. "That was extraordinary. Where did you learn to play like that?" The boy shrugged. Listen. I listen to the sounds around me and try to make them again." The pianist's throat tightened. He could hardly speak. Here was a child who had never been trained, who had probably never owned a piano, yet had just played something that could make hundreds of people cry. Then suddenly, the audience began to clap. Softly at first, then louder and louder until the entire hall filled with thunderous applause. People stood up cheering. Some were whistling, others shouting, "Bravo!" The little boy looked startled. He had never heard applause like that before. He turned toward his mother, who was standing near the aisle with tears running down her cheeks. The pianist gently placed a hand on Eli's shoulder and guided him to stand. Together they faced the crowd. The boy's small figure beside the tall man made the scene even more powerful, a symbol of innocence and genius side by side. The pianist bowed slightly, but then he stepped back, motioning for Eli to bow alone. The crowd roared even louder. Cameras flashed, people cheered, and somewhere in the audience someone whispered, "That boy just made history tonight." And maybe he did. Because in that moment the world wasn't divided by talent, training, or fame. It was united by something far simpler, the sound of a little boy's heart speaking through a piano, and a hall full of people who finally remembered what true music felt like. The pianist stood frozen beside the piano, his face pale and unreadable. The same man who had spent years performing in grand halls around the world now found himself speechless before a child. The little boy, Eli, had just played something that reached beyond skill or training, something alive, something that felt real. The hall was still heavy with emotion. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Eli slowly lifted his hands off the piano keys. His small chest rose and fell as he took a shaky breath. He didn't smile, didn't bow, didn't even look proud. He just sat there staring at the piano like it was an old friend who had finally listened to him. The glow of the stage lights wrapped around him, soft and golden, making him look almost angelic. The pianist blinked a few times as if waking from a dream. He had been watching the boy's fingers the whole time, noticing how natural every movement was. It wasn't just that the boy played beautifully, it was how he played. No hesitation, no fear. Every touch seemed guided by something deeper, something invisible. It was what every artist searched for all their lives, but only a few ever found: truth through art. The applause had started now, but it wasn't like the applause that had filled the room earlier for the pianist. That clapping had been polite, appreciative. This was different. It was wild, emotional, thunderous. It came from hearts, not hands. People were standing on their feet, shouting, crying, smiling. And yet the man beside the piano couldn't move. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. He had practiced his entire life to perfect his craft. He had studied under great teachers, memorized hundreds of classical pieces, and played before crowds who worshipped his skill. But in that moment, standing next to a 10-year-old boy who didn't even know what a sonata was, he felt small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made him remember why he had started playing in the first place. He looked at Eli and said softly, "That was remarkable." His voice trembled slightly, surprising even himself. "Who taught you to play like that?" Eli looked up, shy but calm. "Nobody," he whispered. "I just play what I feel." The man's eyes softened. There it was, the truth. I just play what I feel. Simple, yet so powerful. He thought back to his own childhood years ago, before fame and technique took over. He remembered sneaking into a church late at night to play when no one was watching. Back then, he didn't care about applause or reputation. He just wanted to make sounds that made his heart feel lighter. Over time, though, the world had taught him to play for perfection, not for passion. And standing here now, watching this boy, he realized how far he had drifted from that simple joy. He felt his throat tighten as emotion swelled inside him. For a brief second, he envied the boy, not for his talent, but for his freedom. The child wasn't trapped by expectations or judgment. He didn't play to impress anyone. He played because it made him feel alive. The pianist turned to the audience and raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly, the applause softened until there was silence again. He turned back to Eli, smiling gently. "Would you like to play another?" he asked. Eli's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes," the pianist said, nodding. "The stage is yours." The boy hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should. Then he smiled, a small, nervous smile, and placed his hands on the piano again. The pianist stepped aside, taking a few steps back, choosing to listen rather than lead. This time, the music that came was lighter, joyful, like sunlight breaking through clouds after rain. It had rhythm and warmth, yet still carried that unexplainable emotion that made every note feel personal. The crowd swayed with the sound. Even those who had come expecting a formal classical concert now found themselves smiling through tears. The pianist closed his eyes and listened. And for the first time in many years, he truly listened, not to the accuracy of notes, but to their meaning. He realized that this child was not just gifted. He was teaching everyone in the room something they had forgotten, that music was not about showing skill, but about sharing the heart. When Eli finished the second piece, the audience rose again in applause. The pianist joined them, clapping with all his strength. He walked up to Eli, kneeled down so they were at eye level, and said softly, "You reminded me why I fell in love with music." Eli smiled shyly, unsure how to respond. He just said, "Thank you for letting me play." The man nodded. "No, thank you for playing." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Respect, admiration, and a shared understanding that music was far bigger than either of them. The pianist turned to the audience, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "tonight I was supposed to perform for you, but instead I was the one who learned something." He looked at Eli. This young man reminded us all that music is not in the hands. It's in the heart. The hall erupted again in cheers, louder than before. The pianist gently took Eli's hand and lifted it high, just like a champion's. As the lights dimmed and the curtains began to close, the boy looked up at the pianist one last time. "Will I ever play like you someday?" he asked innocently. The man smiled, eyes glistening. "If you keep playing from your heart," he said softly, "you'll play even better." And with that, the great pianist, once the master of the stage, walked away in silence, leaving the spotlight to the little boy who had reminded the world what true music sounded like. For a long moment after the last note, the air in the grand hall was completely still. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of emotion, thick and trembling, like everyone was afraid that even breathing too loudly would break the magic that had just been created. The piano's final echo had faded, but its memory still hung in the air, heavy and golden. Then slowly it happened. One pair of hands started to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. People stood up from their seats, cheering, shouting, crying, some even laughing from pure disbelief. The sound was deafening, yet somehow it felt soft, because every clap came from the heart. Eli blinked, startled. He wasn't used to this. The roar of hundreds of people made him shrink back a little on the piano bench. His fingers still rested lightly on the keys, his body frozen, unsure what to do. He looked around nervously, then toward the pianist who was still standing beside him, silent, motionless, and watching. The pianist's eyes glistened with a strange mix of wonder and humility. He had seen audiences cheer before, for him, for other great musicians, but never like this. This applause wasn't just admiration. It was awe. It wasn't for performance. It was for feeling. He could see it in their faces. This wasn't the kind of joy that came from hearing a skilled artist. It was the kind that came from being reminded of something pure and forgotten. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes and whispered to the man beside her, "I felt that. I really felt that." He nodded silently, unable to speak. A young girl clutched her father's arm, her eyes wide.
"Daddy, I want to play the piano too,"
She said softly. And somewhere in the crowd, an elderly man closed his eyes, smiling faintly as tears rolled down his wrinkled cheeks. The pianist stepped forward at last. His shoes clicked against the wooden floor as he approached the piano bench. Eli turned to look up at him, still unsure if he had done something wrong or something right. The man smiled gently, his eyes warm. "That was beautiful," he said softly. "You made everyone remember what real music sounds like." Eli blushed, his small shoulders lifting in a shy shrug. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I just played what I felt." The pianist chuckled quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's exactly why it was perfect." He turned toward the audience and raised a hand to quiet them. Slowly, the applause began to fade, though some people continued to clap softly, unwilling to let the moment end. The man looked out over the crowd, then back at the little boy beside him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice echoing softly across the hall, "I have performed in many places in front of many audiences, but tonight I witnessed something I'll never forget." He looked down at Eli again. "This young boy reminded us all that music isn't about how many notes you play, but how much heart you put into each one." The crowd cheered again, louder than before. The pianist smiled, then leaned down and whispered, "Take a bow, Eli." The boy hesitated, unsure how. The man gently guided him, one hand on his small shoulder, the other gesturing toward the crowd. Together they bowed. The applause swelled once more, echoing off the walls, rising like a wave that refused to end. Eli's mother was standing at the side of the hall, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She had been terrified when her son had walked up to that stage, but now she could hardly believe what she'd seen. Her little boy, the one who used to tap tunes on the kitchen table, had just touched hundreds of hearts with nothing but a piano and courage. When the clapping finally began to fade, people started shouting things from the audience. "Encore," someone called. "Let him play again," shouted another voice. The pianist smiled and turned to Eli. "Well," he said softly, "do you want to play another?" Eli looked at the piano, then at the crowd. His eyes were bright, but he shook his head. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I think the piano is tired now." The pianist laughed warmly, a deep, genuine laugh that filled the hall. The audience joined in, smiling and applauding again. He nodded. "Then we'll let it rest." He placed a hand over his heart and gave the boy a small bow. "Thank you, Eli." Eli smiled shyly. "Thank you for letting me try." The pianist looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was respect. Not the kind adults give children out of kindness, but the kind one artist gives another when he knows he's witnessed something rare. As they walked off the stage together, people rushed to the front rows hoping to catch one more glimpse of the boy. Some held out programs for him to sign. Others simply clapped again. Eli held his mother's hand tightly as they left, his small fingers gripping hers, his head still spinning from what had just happened. Outside, the cool night air felt strange after the heat of the lights. His mother knelt down, brushing his hair from his face. "Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling, "do you know what you just did?" He looked up at her with his wide, innocent eyes and said, "I just played." She smiled through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him into her arms. "You did. And you made the whole world listen." Inside the concert hall, the pianist remained standing near the piano. The audience was leaving, but he stayed still, staring at the keys that had just been touched by a child. His fingers brushed them gently, and he smiled to himself. For years, he had chased perfection, but tonight a boy had reminded him of something more powerful than perfection: truth. As the lights dimmed and the hall fell quiet, the pianist whispered under his breath, "That was real music." And somewhere outside, walking down the quiet street hand in hand with his mother, Eli hummed the same melody he had just played, a tune that would stay in every listener's heart long after the lights went out. The morning after the concert, the world seemed quieter, like it was still holding its breath after the magic of the night before. But inside that grand hall something had changed forever. The pianist, now alone, sat at the same piano where Eli had played. The light from the tall windows spilled gently across the polished keys. He lifted his hands but didn't play. Instead, he just stared at the piano, remembering the sound that had come from it when the little boy touched it. He had performed thousands of times, yet last night was different. It wasn't the notes or the skill that stayed with him, it was the feeling. That boy had reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years, the pure joy of playing from the heart. He had been so focused on perfection, on applause, on being the best, that somewhere along the way he had forgotten the why behind his music. He closed his eyes and smiled sadly. A child reminded me of the truth, he whispered to himself. How humbling. That same morning, in a small neighborhood far from the grand concert hall, Eli woke up to the sound of birds outside his window. The house was simple, no marble floors or fancy decorations, just warmth and love. His mother was already in the kitchen making breakfast. When she saw him walk in, she smiled softly. "Good morning, little star," she said. Eli rubbed his eyes. "Mama," he said sleepily, "why were people clapping so much last night?" She chuckled, pouring milk into his glass. "Because you played something beautiful, sweetheart. You touched their hearts," he frowned slightly. "I didn't mean to make them cry." His mother laughed gently. "Sometimes, Eli, when something is truly beautiful, it makes people cry. You didn't do anything wrong. You made them feel something, and that's a gift." Eli smiled faintly, then looked at his small hands. "I just played what I felt inside," he said quietly. "I know," his mother whispered, brushing his hair with her fingers. "And that's why it was perfect." Meanwhile, across town, the news of what had happened had already started spreading. A few people had recorded the performance on their phones. By midday, videos of the little boy who silenced a maestro were all over social media. Headlines read things like, "Child prodigy steals the show at grand concert," "When innocence outplays experience," "Boy's piano performance leaves audience in tears," "The pianist's phone wouldn't stop ringing," journalists wanted interviews. Music schools wanted to know who the boy was. Even television producers called, hoping to get them both on camera together. But the man turned them all down. He didn't want to turn that sacred moment into a spectacle. It wasn't about fame, not for him, not for the boy. Some things, he thought, are too pure to be sold or shared for attention. Instead, he decided to write something, not an article or a statement, but a piece of music. He titled it Eli's Song. It wasn't a complicated piece full of runs and flourishes. It was simple, calm, and full of heart, just like the boy. Every note felt alive, and when he played it, he could almost hear Eli's small hands beside his own. For weeks, he practiced it in secret. Each time, it brought him peace. Each time, it reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Back in Eli's neighborhood, life went on as usual. Kids played in the street. Neighbors chatted, and Eli still spent hours tapping rhythms on tables and humming melodies under his breath. His mother had to remind him to eat sometimes because he would get lost in his imagination, pretending every surface was a piano. One day, a letter arrived, elegant, cream-colored, and sealed with gold. It was from the pianist. Inside was a short message. "Dear Eli, you reminded me that music is not made of notes but of heartbeats. If you ever wish to learn, I would be honored to teach you, not to make you famous, but to help you protect that beautiful gift you already have. With respect, and your friend, the pianist." Eli's mother read the letter aloud, her voice trembling. She looked at her son, her eyes shining with pride. "He wants to teach you, Eli." Eli's eyes widened. "Teach me?" "Yes," she said softly. "He wants to help you learn more." The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Will I still get to play how I feel?" His mother smiled warmly. "I think that's exactly what he wants you to do." Months later, Eli and the pianist met again, not in a grand hall, but in a small music room filled with sunlight and warmth. The man didn't treat Eli like a student. He treated him like a partner. They played together, learning from each other. The boy taught the man how to feel again, and the man taught the boy how to shape his feelings into music that could travel farther and last longer. Sometimes, when they finished playing, they would sit in silence. No words were needed. The connection between them, one built on mutual respect and pure love for music, said everything. One evening, after a lesson, the pianist said, "Eli, do you know what makes music powerful?" The boy shook his head. "It's not how loud or how perfect it is," the man said. "It's how honest it is. People will always forget your mistakes, but they'll never forget your truth. Eli nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. From that day on, every time he touched a piano, he remembered that lesson. He played not to impress, not to perform, but to tell a story, his story. And in the quiet of that small room, 2 generations sat side by side, one rediscovering his purpose, the other discovering his gift, both guided by the same truth, that the heart, when given a voice, can create music that never dies. The story of that night spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Within days, newspapers, blogs, and television channels across the country were talking about the little boy who silenced a maestro. Clips of Eli playing the piano filled people's social media feeds. Strangers who had never met him were crying behind their screens, replaying the moment again and again. People called it a miracle. They said it was proof that talent can come from anywhere, that sometimes the most powerful music comes from those who have never been trained. But for Eli, life didn't change in the way people expected. He wasn't thinking about fame or interviews. He still woke up early for school, helped his mother carry groceries, and played outside with his friends. If anyone mentioned the concert, he would just smile shyly and say, "Oh, that was just one song." His mother, however, noticed something different in him. Since that night, he seemed calmer, more thoughtful. He would sit by the window in the evenings, tapping invisible piano keys on his lap, humming softly. There was a quiet confidence in him now, not pride, but peace. He knew what he loved, and he understood what it meant to share it. Meanwhile, the pianist, whose name had always been on posters and concert programs, was now being asked about Eli wherever he went. Every interview began with the same question: "Tell us about the boy." At first, he found it amusing. But then he realized that every time he talked about Eli, people listened more carefully than when he spoke about his own career. And he didn't mind. In fact, he felt proud, because deep down, he knew that something rare had happened, something that went beyond fame or reputation. He began to include Eli's song in his performances. Before playing it, he would always tell the audience, "This piece is inspired by a young boy who reminded me what true music means." And every time he played it, the audience would fall silent, moved not just by the music but by the story behind it. Letters started arriving for him, not about himself but about the boy. People wrote things like, "I showed the video to my daughter, and now she wants to learn piano. Your story reminded me to follow my passion again. That child made me cry, not because I was sad, but because I felt alive." The pianist smiled every time he read them. He realized that Eli's gift wasn't just music, it was connection. He had touched something in people that no performance ever could. Months later, a foundation for young musicians invited both Eli and the pianist to a special event. They wanted to honor them for redefining the meaning of art and talent. The pianist accepted immediately, but he called Eli's mother first. "Would Eli like to come?" he asked gently. Eli's mother hesitated. "He's still a child, you know. He doesn't really understand all this attention." "That's fine," said the pianist. "He doesn't need to understand it. I just want him to play." And so a few weeks later they stood together again, on a smaller stage this time, not a grand concert hall. The crowd was full of children, teachers, and families. The air was light, full of excitement and warmth. The pianist spoke first. "I want to tell you all something," he said into the microphone. "Music isn't about showing the world what you can do. It's about showing the world who you are. Last year, a little boy taught me that." He turned to Eli, who was standing beside him in a neat shirt and vest, looking both nervous and curious. "Would you do me the honor, Eli?" Eli nodded quietly and sat at the piano. This time he didn't hesitate. His small hands found the keys with ease, and he began to play. Not the same song as before, but something new. Something gentle and hopeful. It was as if he had grown since that night, not just in age, but in spirit. The melody was simple, but it carried joy. The kind of joy that comes after understanding pain. The kind that comes from knowing who you are. The pianist watched from the side, smiling the whole time. He didn't feel like a mentor or a teacher. He felt like a witness onto someone lucky enough to have seen a miracle happen twice. Lucky enough to have seen a miracle happen twice. When Eli finished, the room erupted with applause again, but this time he didn't look nervous. He stood, bowed softly and smiled at his mother in the audience. After the performance, a reporter came up to the pianist and asked, "Do you think Eli will become the next great musician?" The man chuckled. "He already is," he said simply, "because greatness isn't about fame. It's about truth, and that boy plays nothing but truth." As they left the stage, Eli tugged at his sleeve. "Sir," he said shyly, "when I play, it feels like I'm talking to someone. Is that strange?" The pianist shook his head. "Not at all," he said with a soft smile. "That's exactly what music is, a conversation between your heart and the world." Later that evening, as they walked out into the cool night air, the stars glittered above them like tiny lights on a piano sheet. Eli looked up at the sky, humming his new melody. The pianist walked beside him, hands behind his back, thinking about how much one small act, a simple, brave question, had changed both their lives. "Can I try?" the boy had asked that night. And because he did, the world was still listening. Years passed, but the memory of that night, the night a little boy asked, "Can I try?" never faded. It became a story people told again and again, a quiet legend that warmed hearts every time it was remembered. The video of Eli's performance lived on the internet for years, watched by millions across the world. But for those who had been there that night, no recording could ever capture what it truly felt like. The hush before the first note, the stillness after the last, the feeling that something sacred had passed through the room. Eli grew older, but he never let fame or attention change him. He didn't chase the spotlight. In fact, he often avoided it. While others called him a prodigy, he just called himself a boy who loved the piano. He still lived in the same quiet neighborhood with his mother. The piano lessons with the old maestro continued, but they weren't lessons in the traditional sense. They were conversations, shared silences, and moments of discovery. The pianist, now older, his silver hair turning white, often told people that Eli had become his greatest teacher. He would smile and say, "That boy reminded me of something I had forgotten, that music isn't learned, it's remembered. It lives in us long before we ever touch a key." By the time Eli was a teenager, his playing had matured. He could perform classical pieces with precision and power, but he always added a touch of himself, a softness, a sincerity that made every note sound like a heartbeat. When he played, people didn't just listen, they felt. Yet even with all the recognition he received, he never lost the simplicity that made him special. He often played at small community events, nursing homes, and local schools. Children gathered around him, mesmerized just as he once had been. He would smile and tell them, "You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest." The old pianist would sometimes visit those performances, sitting quietly in the back. He never interrupted, never corrected, and he simply listened, proud and content. Seeing Eli play filled him with peace. He knew his own journey had come full circle. The boy who once asked, "Can I try?" had become the living proof that real music didn't need a stage or fame. It only needed a heart brave enough to share its sound. One afternoon, many years later, Eli visited the pianist at his countryside home. The once energetic man was frail now, his hands thin and trembling, but his eyes still bright with kindness. The grand piano sat in the corner, covered with a white cloth. Eli approached it gently. "You don't play anymore?" he asked softly. The old man smiled weakly. "These hands are tired," he said, "but they've done enough. Now it's your turn." Eli lifted the cloth and sat down. "What should I play?" The man looked at him with a peaceful smile. "Play what you feel," he whispered. And so Eli began. The melody that flowed was neither rehearsed nor planned. It was tender and full of warmth, the kind of music that carried memories, gratitude, and love. As the notes filled the small room, the old pianist closed his eyes. He could feel every vibration in his chest, every emotion woven between the keys. When the song ended, Eli turned, but the man had fallen asleep in his chair, a gentle smile on his face. It wasn't a sad moment. It was peaceful, like the final note of a song that had said everything it needed to say. Years later, at the pianist's memorial concert, Eli stood on stage again. The same boy, now grown, the same piano, now older, and the same light of humility still shining in his eyes. The hall was filled with people, musicians, students, and friends, all waiting in silence. Eli took a deep breath and began to play Eli's song, the piece his mentor had written for him all those years ago. The melody rose gently, full of beauty and longing, echoing through the grand hall. Many in the audience wept quietly, not just because it was beautiful, but because they could feel the love behind every note. When he finished, Eli whispered into the microphone, his voice soft but steady. "Once I asked a man if I could try. He said yes, and that one yes changed my life. He taught me that music isn't about how loud you play or how many people hear you. It's about the truth you carry inside you. I'll keep playing, for him, and for anyone who needs to remember what it feels like to believe." The audience stood in silence for a moment before clapping. Slow, emotional, and full of respect. As Eli walked off the stage, he looked up at the ceiling lights, imagining his old mentor watching from somewhere beyond. "Thank you," he whispered, "for hearing me when no one else did." Outside, the night was calm, and the stars glimmered softly, the same stars that had shone the night he first touched that grand piano. And as Eli walked home, he smiled, knowing deep down that the story wasn't over. Somewhere another little boy or girl would one day ask, "Can I try?" And the world would listen all over again.